I am delighted to welcome you to today's panel discussion on Nuclear Security Summit's Impact and Assessment. My colleague Richard Weitz, who directs Hudson's Center for Political Military Analysis, is currently in Asia and can't be with us here today, but sends regards from Thailand. Since the end of the Cold War, numerous efforts have been undertaken to secure nuclear materials around the globe. 2 decades later, despite some noticeable successes, we are in as precarious a situation as ever with the emergence of the threat of nuclear terrorism. Today, our distinguished panel of experts will examine developments in nuclear security since the 2010 summit here in Washington, D.C., and look ahead to desired outcomes from the next nuclear security summit in South Korea in 2012. I now have the pleasure of turning the event over to Catherine Gokul, Deputy Director of the Partnership for Secure America. Many thanks, Kathy, for partnering with us and for moving the discussion forward.
I'm just going to speak from here if that's okay with everyone. Again, I am the Deputy Director at Partnership for Secure America. And for those of you who don't know us, we were actually founded by Lee Hamilton and Warren Redmond to work on bipartisan solutions to national security and foreign policy issues. They felt the discourse had gotten to a point where perhaps maybe a little bit more formal effort was needed. And to that end, we do a series of programming. We do the programs we do with Stanley and Hudson, We also do other programming on Iran, the UN, and energy. And we also are known for our statements we put out. You have a couple of those, I believe, in your chair. And one of our key programs is we have a Congressional Fellowship Program. It's now in its 5th session, and we actually select a group of congressional staff from both parties to come together, and we put them through about a 4-month training process to help them have the skills and abilities and relationships to work across the aisle. We're not asking anybody to give up what they think, we're just asking
If you are not familiar with the Stanley Foundation, we're a private operating foundation based in Muscatine, Iowa, focused on peace and security work for more than 50 years now. And a piece of our work currently is focused on nuclear material security. And I oversee that programming on behalf of the foundation, and that's why I am quite pleased to be here today with an excellent panel to my left and have the pleasure of moderating this discussion. So thank you again for being here. As was alluded to in the beginning, the end of the Cold War left us with and the fall of the Soviet Union left us with a legacy of weapons and materials. And that was initially addressed through the Nunn-Lugar Act or cooperative threat reduction programs that are still in existence and operation today. But post 9/11, we also saw a flurry of new instruments, initiatives, and efforts to deal with an increased perception of the threat of nuclear terrorism. And a lot of those multilateral efforts include things like the Proliferation Security Initiative, the Global Threat Reduction Initiative, UN Security Council Resolution 1540. There were many efforts made to try to address this. These, along with 2 key conventions, the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material, as well as the International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism, make up today's architecture, Ken's word that I borrow, for nuclear material security. But along with all of that came a key and significant event that started with an announcement made by President Obama in his Prague speech in 2009, where he indicated that this was one of his priorities in terms of a nuclear nonproliferation agenda, and announced that he would be inviting heads of state to Washington, D.C. for a summit on the topic. This was a historic moment in the sense that heads of state had never gathered together to address this particular issue. It did bring together the leaders of 47 nations. Nearly all of them were heads of state level. And they took a look at that existing architecture and put forward a number of actions that they would be willing to take as a collective group to improve the state of nuclear security globally. So in 2010, in April, that group issued a communique, a work plan, and many of those countries individually also made commitments beyond the communique and work plan to take action. So we're 18 months later from that point, and some of us have spent a fair amount of time analyzing, what has been done since the last summit, and I hope that our panel today will address that a bit. But we're also 6 months from the next Nuclear Security Summit, which is being hosted by the Republic of Korea at the end of March next year. And that will be another important step for those leaders to get back together to consider what has happened in the last 2 years and what else they need to do in terms of action as a collective group of nations. So just to briefly introduce that topic, I think the questions that we would like to see the panelists address, and then certainly you'll have a chance to ask your questions as well, are, what have the accomplishments been since the 2010 summit? What are the desired outcomes for 2012? And then long term, what are the impacts of the summits? Thinking beyond even in 2012, there's, I think, still a question mark as to whether there will be a 2014 summit, but maybe Laura has information that none of us has. But generally, even thinking beyond that, this was set out as a 4-year initiative. Do these summits have a long-term impact and effect, and what is it? You all provided bios of our panelists today, so rather than spend a significant amount of time introducing them to you by reading their bios, I will instead just introduce them with their titles. We're going to start to my far left with Ms. Laura Holgate, who is the Senior Director for WMD Terrorism and Threat Reduction on the National Security Council staff. So I will turn it over to you, Laura, and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, and thanks to the multiple organizers for today's event. That speaks, I think, to the breadth of the audience and as well to the timeliness of the topic. So I welcome a chance to be here and also to learn from friends like Chris and Ken at a moment where we're actually working quite intensively as we prepare for next March's summit. Just a little bit about the previous summit. As Jennifer mentioned, it was a historic summit in the sense of 47 countries here in Washington, plus 3 international organizations. And while it was certainly the largest summit in Washington ever, and among the first of this issue, I should mention that technically it was the second Nuclear Security Summit. Ken and I worked together on an event in Moscow in 1996. Was that about the right
I don't remember
time?
yesterday, Laura. No, it was 1996.
There was, in fact, a Nuclear Security Summit highlighting, in the context of the G7 plus 1, in that time frame, looking primarily at the U.S.-Russian context of the cooperation and, in fact, highlighting many of the successes of the cooperative threat reduction or non-Luger programs. Susan is in the audience. She'll probably remember which year it was. But the way we conceived the summit in 2010, I think, reflects the way the issue has matured, that the risks associated with nuclear materials and nuclear weapons are as much, if not more, global, about the global challenges as they are about the bilateral challenges, and that haunted us in the 90s. And I think that's why we wanted a very diverse group of countries. We wanted to be sure that we caught countries with a range of political views. This was not a coalition of the willing. This was not just, the typical traditional friends of the United States. If you look at the list of 47 attendees, you'll see a wide diversity regionally. You'll see a diversity ideologically. You'll see a diversity, especially in various nuclear contexts. There were countries there were P5 countries who are allowed to have weapons. There were countries with weapons who happen to have them, but are the outlier 3, as some call them. There were countries who used to have weapons and don't anymore. There were countries that people worry about might want weapons in the future. There were countries with large amounts of nuclear material, small amounts of nuclear material, no nuclear material whatsoever. Countries with large energy programs, small nuclear energy programs, future energy programs, and in some cases past nuclear energy programs. So we had really a lot of different perspectives, and I think while there has been, some discussion among international relations theorists about the legitimacy that attaches to, mini-lat or informal multilateral activities such as this, I think the diversity of the community that was part of the summit process lends legitimacy to the conclusions that came out of it. And those conclusions are manifest in a communique and a work plan that have been widely publicly distributed. And if you haven't read them, I commend them to you. I will not bore you with reciting the details. But I think what was important about those is that it reflected a level of consensus that I think surprised people, and in terms of the reality of the risk, in terms of the support for President Obama's 4-year lockdown effort, and in terms of actual commitments to do real things. And this was a notion that was later dubbed, or it became into public, that we'd been calling them house gifts. That wasn't intended to be a public reference, but it's become part of the shorthand of the summit. That over 30 countries came and pledged to do specific things connected with the broader commitments of the communique and the work plan, and things that were changed the reality in terms of either materials removed or contributions to availability of resources for international programs, or passages of new laws, accessions to treaties, and so on. And so one of the things that I would also commend to you is a recent report from this summer by Ken's organization and the Arms Control Association that highlights progress against those national commitments. And even I was pleasantly surprised to find that as of April of this year, the appearance was that 60% of those national commitments had been completed, and that another 30% was on track for completion by next April. So I think that reflects one of the really important outcomes of the last summit. But I think another piece of the puzzle is the attention that it did give to the architecture, if you will. And I think we even at one point had the word architecture in the summit documents in describing the network of treaties, UN Security Council resolutions, institutions, relationships, and mechanisms and processes that underpin the progress towards securing nuclear material around the world. And when you look at the success of the summit, I think there's a set of intangibles, some tangible, but also some intangibles related to the strengthening the foundations, the political foundations of that architecture. And that, in my view, is one of the most important things we can be doing. It's one of the things that we said we wanted to do from the get-go. Unfortunately, there became, in the course of the summit, from some of our summit participants, a straw man erected that somehow the Nuclear Security Summit was intended to replace or might have the effect of undercutting this architecture. And in fact, that was never the case, and we were finally able in March of this year to put that to rest, I hope. That in fact, the purpose of the summit is to, let's see, there's 4 E words that I like to use to describe: expand, empower, elevate, and execute against the commitments that represent, and the structures and activities that represent that architecture. Looking forward to the 2012 summit, here again, I think the message delivered by the Korean hosts of that summit reflects the new world of nuclear threats. The reality that this is, again, not a U.S.-Russia thing. It's not about nuclear weapons. It's not about the old bilateral nuclear relationship. It is a new world. Nuclear security is something to which every country can contribute, that every country has a stake in and can benefit from. And I think the understanding as well that nuclear materials in connection with the civil nuclear fuel cycle can be part of the nuclear terrorism threat. In the context, actually, of improvised nuclear devices, I'm not necessarily speaking here of radiological weapons. I think that is starting to be better understood, and I think the Korean hosting of that, given their rise as a player on the global nuclear energy market, helps make that point in a very constructive way. Looking forward to 2012 from a U.S. point of view, we're hoping for, I think, 3 things. One is to see and commemorate and celebrate progress against pledges made last year. Second is to provide a moment to engender new pledges, new specific sets of actions that can be taken. And finally, to move the consensus, to try to use the summit, the attention of senior political figures, to be able to move some of the issues that have been stuck a little bit in the international dialogue. I want to say a couple words about the scope of the next summit. But before I turn to that, let me just say a couple things about progress that we've seen from the U.S. point of view against, for example, the president's 4-year lockdown agenda, which is one way to measure progress. That agenda, as most of you know, has 3 levels of activity. One is at the site level. One is at the other level is at national levels. And finally, we have a global level of effort in that 4-year lockdown. And at the site level, we've seen dozens of nuclear weapons worth of nuclear material removed from vulnerable facilities around the world, and we have several additional removals on the docket between now and the March summit. We've had hundreds of kilograms of highly enriched uranium permanently destroyed from in some cases from those removals, in other cases from former weapons stockpiles. We've seen security upgrades at a number of buildings, particularly looking at the longstanding U.S.-Russian bilateral cooperation there, as well as cooperation on shipments and storage of weapons. At the national level, one of the most interesting things that came out of the last summit is this renewed attention to the human component of nuclear security, the importance of training, the importance of what's called security culture. And over a dozen countries announced in either at the last summit or in the months since that they're opening national and regional nuclear security training centers, or so-called centers of excellence in many cases. And we've even seen a meeting at the International Atomic Energy Agency to help coordinate those better and connect those up. So I think that's a really interesting development of how to improve nuclear security at the national level. We've also have set up focused nuclear security dialogues at the bilateral level between U.S. and the UK, France, Japan, and other countries. Looking globally, since the last summit, the IAEA has issued its updated and strengthened guidance documents on nuclear material security, the well-known INFCIRC 225 Rev 5, for those who follow that topic. The budget for the IAEA's nuclear security activities has increased in the regular budget for the IAEA, and there have also been additional contributions to the voluntary fund that helps supplement that budget. The UN Security Council has extended the mandate of its Resolution 1540, which sets the only global binding commitment on nations to secure nuclear materials. This is a really important tool let me stick to the architecture thing, an important brick in our architecture. The Interpol has established a radiological and nuclear terrorism prevention unit that will help increase worldwide law enforcement capability to seize nuclear material, focusing on the black market and the nuclear smuggling piece of the puzzle. And since last April, we've seen 13 countries ratify the key amendments or the key treaties related to nuclear security, whether the amendment to the Convention on Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials, and also the International Convention on Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism. And so this is, I think, tangible progress, and progress that, while certainly inspired by the summit, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that without the summit that wouldn't have happened, but I think it's fair to say that without the summit, all of that wouldn't have happened. And I think that gives us a really good platform moving forward to show real progress. Let me just say a couple words about the scope of the next summit. I think one of the things that we heard over and over from counterparts in the summit process was that the success of it was because it was specific and focused on nuclear security. It left the non-proliferation treaty issues at the door. In fact, the RevCon was scheduled 6 weeks after the summit. We wanted to be really clear that we were not in any way attempting to pre-negotiate that. This was a different set of topics. What's important is that we maintain that focus going forward. There has been one important international event since then in the nuclear environment, and that is the Fukushima accidents, and I think we recognize that world leaders will not be able to get together in Seoul and be silent on that topic. But there is consensus among the summit participants that the nuclear safety question should play a very small role in next year's summit. That the focus should remain on security. That's the success. And frankly, there's a lot of venues internationally over the next several months in which nuclear safety will be addressed, including at the head of state level. We don't need to use this special vehicle to address that issue as well. The other question that comes up automatically just because of the venue is whether or not the summit will reference North Korea. And this is understandable because for South Korean public, their big nuclear security problem is North Korea. They don't think about it in the context of materials or in the context of smuggling or in some of the broader issues that the summit actually addresses. And so there is this kind of drumbeat or expectation currently within the Korean population that there might be something on this. What we, from the U.S. point of view and from the Korean point of view as well, I think we recognize that any effort to deal with North Korea within the four corners of the official summit process will probably be counterproductive. There are other established venues, again, with legitimacy and authority to rule on that issue. We certainly would not want to have anything that came out of the Nuclear Security Summit undercut comments and commitments and consensus reached in those other venues. That being said, there may be some opportunity on the margins of the summit for some subset of the summit countries to participate in some activity relating to the threat on the northern border. But the Korean government has not yet determined what that might be. But I think that's part of the education and the expectation setting that really needs to be worked in Korea to help people understand that is the limitation of this process. All that being said, I think we've got an exciting set of meetings ahead of us. We have a communique that's already in negotiation. We'll be meeting at the beginning of next month in Helsinki with our Sherpa team to continue negotiations. Another Sherpa meeting will be in January in New Delhi, and then the summit itself will be in March. And so we have a lot of work to do between now and then. The communique that the Koreans have proposed sits kind of between the work plan and the communique from the last summit in terms of level of detail. It's a little bit more detailed, but it's not nearly, but not as comprehensive as the work plan. And I think this was because we all agreed that we wanted to leave the 2010 documents as such. We're not trying to update them. We're not trying to supplant them. They exist. They continue to guide us. This new communique for this next summit is about how far have we come and where new are we going. And so that's really going to be the focus of the next summit. Thanks so much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Laura. Next, immediately to Laura's right, we'll hear from Dr. Christopher Ford, who is a senior fellow and director of the Center for Technology and Global Security here at the Hudson Institute. He also served as the U.S. Special Representative for Nuclear Nonproliferation, and I'm sure he'll bring that experience to his comments today. So, Chris?
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back at another nuclear security event here at Hudson, and thanks again to PSA and Stanley for making it possible. Clearly, I think some real progress has been made in the last year or so on nuclear security issues, and I want to commend Laura and her team for all that sort of thing. Just to mention a few of them, Russia appears to have finally ended its plutonium production at Zelenogorsk, and it signed a plutonium disposition protocol with the U.S. For its part, Kazakhstan secured more of its HEU. Chile removed its last HEU supplies back to the U.S., in fact. Ukraine removed a sizable batch of HEU, and Mexico committed to converting its research reactor to LEU, low-enriched uranium, that is, while China has agreed with U.S. authorities to establish one of the centers of excellence to which Laura referred, to study and promote best practices and that sort of thing. These are all very important good things, and I don't want to slight them. Although, of course, one should be cautious, and Laura alluded to this, one should be cautious about attributing, not overselling the degree to which these things would have happened, would not have happened but for the summit, I could say. HEU removal, for instance, just to give one example, has been a major U.S. policy priority for many, many years, with all kinds of successes to boast. I think something on the order of, according to the NNSA's website, something like 22 reactors have now been converted to LEU since 2004 when President Bush established the GTRI initiative in the Department of Energy. Chile's HEU removal, for example, also occurred shortly before the NSS, and the Russian plutonium stuff had been underway and took years of very painful negotiation. It was announced shortly after the summit, apparently in an effort to create a swell of favorable publicity, but it certainly was underway long before. So I would caution you against the leap of assuming that just because it occurred after the summit, that therefore the summit is entirely to deserve credit for it. But that said, the summit, I think, does seem to have spurred things along in important ways, and it deserves credit for that. But unfortunately, everything is not entirely rosy, and I guess it's my role on these panels to be something of the grump, so let me offer a little perspective from that angle. The most recent setback, of course, seems to have been in connection with Belarus, which, amidst much fanfare in December of last year, signed an agreement with the U.S. whereby it would transfer its HEU stockpile back to Russia in exchange for supplies of low-enriched uranium. Now, since Belarus is apparently the only country in the former Soviet Union with a sizable stockpile of HEU that still remains, something like 500 pounds worth, correct me if I'm wrong on that one, this was indeed described as being huge progress. Unfortunately, the dictatorship of Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus is very fond of cracking down on political opponents, both real and imagined, and this has led to the United States' imposition of human rights sanctions on his government. Not, I suppose, all that surprisingly, concluding that how he treats his own people is his own business and not that of anybody else, Lukashenko didn't take very well to this and promptly suspended the new HEU deal with the U.S. Belarus now says that it will resume HEU relinquishment if and when the United States drops its human rights sanctions. Now, this is obviously a setback to the agenda, but I think it goes beyond just a particular question of misbehavior by one particular dictator. And I'd like to flag for you the potential moral hazard problems that I think can sometimes arise when high publicity multilateral public diplomacy initiatives can get entangled in the acquisitive politics of a wayward view. Belarus had long resisted, this is just sort of an illustrative case, I fear, but Belarus had long resisted giving up its HEU stockpile, seeing this as a bargaining chip with which it could continue to obtain what the New York Times has called the loans and handouts that it needs to sustain its Soviet-style command economy. And indeed, the administration obligingly coupled Belarus's signature on the HEU deal not merely with technical advice on how best to use the replacement LEU, but also with what the paper describes at least as an undisclosed amount of financial assistance. Now, to me, this sounds like a fancy way of saying that Lukashenko's regime was basically paid in order to provide the NSS with a public success. Indeed, it's not entirely clear that there was a loose nuclear material challenge in Belarus to start with. According to Matt Bunn up at Harvard, Belarus's HEU was already stored in an adequately secure facility. Now, I'll grant you that it's much better to return HEU for downblending in Russia, and that the general principle of HEU return, which, as I mentioned, has been a U.S. priority for a long time, is an important one. But it's hard to escape the suspicion, at least, that the December deal was as much about the political atmospherics of demonstrating an NSS, Nuclear Security Summit, success as it was about actually securing anything that might otherwise have been stolen by terrorists. So I worry a little bit that our eagerness to show progress on these commitments may be having the effect to some degree of commoditizing the retention of nuclear material, giving strongmen like Lukashenko reasons to hang on to them in search of the highest price, even while giving such rulers potent tools for counter-leverage against U.S. policy and other actors. Now, this moral hazard problem, I will admit, is inherent to some degree in any effort to reach solutions on an issue landscape that involves all kinds of competing priorities and trade-offs. There's no, at the end of the day, there's no complete way around these sorts of concerns. But I do worry that such gamesmanship is a particular vulnerability for the kind of multilateral diplomatic efforts that characterized the 2010 summit, precisely because they deliberately aim to raise the public profile and political stakes so very high. Now, by comparison, I'd offer you the example of the long-running and very successful Nunn-Lugar program, through which U.S. officials have secured vast quantities of materials in the former Soviet Union. The details of this program were negotiated and adapted over time through comparatively quiet and technical ongoing diplomacy as a part of an effort that wasn't tied to dramatic public benchmarks, such as the need to demonstrate grand progress in time for the next big summit. Moreover, while we certainly paid a great deal of money to accomplish Nunn-Lugar goals, this consisted of the expenses of the program. Money being by its nature fungible, I don't pretend that this was not of great benefit to Russia, but it was at least related to the project and was not the same thing as tossing in an additional sweetener on top of a broader nuclear deal, a narrower nuclear deal, I should say. Unfortunately, it looks a little bit like Lukashenko was working perhaps more from the North Korean nuclear negotiating playbook than he was from any position of seriousness on nuclear security. Now, to his credit, President Obama has spoken out forthrightly against diplomatic approaches in places like North Korea, for example, in which, although a dictator behaves badly, if it waits long enough, it ends up being rewarded, and these are his words, with foodstuffs and fuel and concessionary loans and a whole range of benefits. Now, that's true, and I commend him for that position. I worry that it may be important to be perhaps a bit more careful that the politics of the Nuclear Security Summit process don't create analogous problems and incentives elsewhere. Speaking of which, North Korea is, of course, itself trying to take advantage of the general global eagerness to show progress in 2012. It, of course, doesn't seem particularly interested in promoting nuclear security, nor in making nuclear terrorism less likely. After all, this is the country that not too long ago built a plutonium production reactor in Syria. But the DPRK is very interested in garnering additional political legitimacy, if that's even the right phrase to use in their context, obtaining economic assistance, and most of all, perhaps, in securing some kind of recognition as a legitimate nuclear weapons possessor. After last year's summit in Washington, the North Korean Foreign Ministry proclaimed itself willing to join the international efforts for nuclear non-proliferation and on nuclear security. Its condition, of course, for participation, however, was that it be allowed to participate on an equal footing with other nuclear weapons states. So this doesn't seem to have gotten it much, to everyone's credit, so far, but it points, I think, to this sort of ongoing challenge of managing the moral hazard problems of the high-stakes games that these kinds of summits create. The summit process is, in fact, designed, quite self-consciously, to leverage the political pressure of high-intensity media and diplomatic exposure, including the personal involvement of heads of state, in order to entice countries to take sensible security steps, of which they can boast at the next meeting, or perhaps at least to get them to do things so as not to be identified as having done nothing. Either way, there's virtue in that. It's a powerful motivator, and it has, I think, been having some success. But the Belarus and the would-be North Korean examples also suggest that this kind of high-stakes multilateral showboat diplomacy can sometimes cut the other direction as well. It creates pressures also on those who have staked their diplomatic reputation on the success of the process, pressures to game the diplomacy of demonstrating progress by overselling stage-managed displays of success, or by purchasing cooperative steps in ways that create moral hazard problems that are perhaps not conducive to long-term progress. One wonders, perhaps, whether a more conventional approach involving quieter and more informal negotiations with multiple partners and on multiple fronts might have produced just as much security payoff with fewer externalities. But anyway, moving ahead. As I understand it, the Obama administration intends that the upcoming summit in Seoul will help deepen cooperation on nuclear security issues, add political momentum to IAEA efforts to keep tabs on the uses to which nuclear materials and technology are put, and lead to additional actions to secure materials and prevent illicit trafficking. I wish it success in all these things, for these are very worthy goals indeed. But there is some discussion, and I think Laura alluded to this as well, about whether we should aim to do more with this next summit than simply replicate and update the last one. Some, for instance, have suggested taking Fukushima as our cue and adding nuclear safety to the agenda, or perhaps even adding non-proliferation. My instinct is that Laura's quite right. Such expansions would probably distract from the core work that the summit process is intended to accomplish. As my own editorial sideline, I would also note, I think that opening up the issue of non-proliferation in the summit context would probably open a Pandora's box of issues on which the world already has all sorts of opportunities to disagree elsewhere. But if you were to expand the summit agenda, and as I've indicated, I think there's a good case for not doing so, a better bet might be to try to do more to secure radioactive sources, such as the isotopes that are used in hospitals and laboratories around the world. There are, by various estimates, between 100,000 and 1 million radioactive sources of this sort distributed worldwide, some of which are likely to be very useful in a dirty bomb, a radiological dispersal device, to use the jargon phrase, an RDD. As I argued from this very spot, I think, in April of last year, I think it was one of the defects of the 2010 summit that no one really tried to address this question of radiological dispersal devices or terrorist dirty bombs. And now that there is, in fact, some talk, at least in the media, of potentially trying to address sources in 2012 in Seoul, it might be time for us to rectify the failure. I think it may also finally be time to seek real funding commitments from countries that claim to support the nuclear security agenda. In addressing our earlier event here at Hudson, on this subject, I expressed disappointment that there was no effort made in 2010 to obtain such commitments at the time. But why not use the opportunity of this next big gathering of heads of state to pass the hat in support of measures that will likely be needed if we are to secure nuclear material worldwide? Now, the Nunn-Lugar program that I mentioned earlier is a good example, I think, of the kind of progress that can be made in cooperative threat reduction, especially with countries that may lack the capacity to do a great deal of such work on their own. But it was very expensive, and it was funded essentially entirely by the U.S. taxpayer. Already, however, as anyone who's been reading the newspapers knows, we are having all kinds of trouble securing funding for U.S. programs, including non-proliferation programs, in Washington today. And this is unfortunately likely to get worse rather than better on account of our budget and public debt problem. So while Nunn-Lugar may be a good example of the kind of work that may need to be done, it cannot be the model, I think, for funding it. This is a terrible time to ask the U.S. taxpayer to fix everyone else's security problem. So I think we should probably do what we can to make nuclear security a cooperative effort, genuinely so. President Bush and his fellow G8 leaders started the Global Partnership in 2002 in order to help do just this sort of thing. But I worry that today's G8 leaders seem to have dangerously bobbled the ball. For example, it was the last year after the summit, in fact, the G8 declined to extend the Global Partnership, leaving it on a track, at that point at least, to expire in 2012, ironically, not too long after the next Nuclear Security Summit. Now, this has been rectified, and I think it was last spring, in May perhaps, that they managed to rally and finally did extend the Global Partnership past its original expiration date. But I don't think anyone has missed the message that enthusiasm for this sort of thing is unfortunately not what it once was. So I would suggest that if we're serious about nuclear security, it's time for some real hat passing in Seoul. And finally, let me just express some disappointment that there still seems to be no prospect of world leaders addressing another problem that I flagged from this podium in April of 2010 in discussing the Nuclear Security Summit. As far as I know, no official involved in the summit process has yet to say anything about the challenge of ongoing nuclear material production, and in particular the production of the proliferation of fuel cycle technologies that allow the production of ever more material that will, of course, need also to be kept out of the wrong hands. On that front, there seems to have been very little progress. And in this respect, I'd like to put my own spin on Laura's mention of the human component, if you will, of nuclear security. I think we should also be thinking more about knowledge and technology security, in addition to just thinking about material security. Anyway, thanks for listening and your patience, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Chris. And now we'll move to our final panelist, Kenneth Luongo. Immediately to my left is the president of the Partnership for Global Security. He also wears the hat of co-chair of the Fissile Materials Working Group, a coalition of non-governmental organizations that spans the globe and has grown quite quickly in the last couple of years. So, Ken?
Thanks, Jen, and thanks to the Stanley Foundation and Hudson Institute and the Partnership for Secure America for inviting me today. I'm happy to participate. So as a third speaker, I'm supposed to say, well, one speaker said the porridge is too hot and the other one said the porridge is too cold. And I'm going to make a pitch for changing the recipe for the porridge. Because I think we've gone just about as far as we can in the current configuration on this issue, and I think we need to find a different path forward to try and make some real progress on this. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. What I really want to do is build on all of the good work that's been done up to this point. And with that, you know, Laura, I don't remember the exact date of the first summit in Russia, frankly, sorry to say. But I mean, all of the work that we did with the Russians is obviously the foundation on which the global expansion of this agenda has been built. And so I think that the Nuclear Security Summit in Washington last year was a very big success, both from a political and substantive perspective. And I do think that it underscored that it helped solidify the foundation of the existing architecture for nuclear material security. My problem with it is it didn't push the boundaries of that architecture far enough, and I don't think that what we have in place is adequate to deal with the threat as it evolves in the 21st century. And if you look at the first decade of this evolution, you begin to see the seeds of what's coming in another 10 or 20 or 30 years, which is that nuclear materials and nuclear facilities are going to spread into a very dangerous region where it currently doesn't exist in any large measure, which is the Middle East, and is going to grow, in particular in Asia. So, in my view, I think that the 2012 Nuclear Security Summit offers an opportunity for begin to move this agenda into the 21st century, strengthening its capabilities and its requirements. But I think that the Seoul Summit needs to be a clear pivot point in that direction, and not kind of a soft, I don't know, wave that comes on top of the 2010 accomplishments of the first summit. I think if we don't pivot and move in this direction, then I think the Nuclear Security Summit process is going to lose steam, and I also think it's going to lose value. So in my view, the Seoul Summit needs to identify some clear new objectives and also define a process for how to meet those objectives. And it can certainly include some of what was stated in the work plan and in a communique from Washington, because there was a lot of important stuff in there, and I don't think you can obviously avoid it and just ignore it. I think you need to include it and build on it. But I do think there are three things that are really required for Seoul. The first is new initiatives. The second is funding streams. I completely agree with Chris. And the third is an issue that we haven't talked about today, which is partnering and making sure that all of the stakeholders that have something to contribute to this are integrated in a better way than they are today. And I frankly think that from say what you want about multilateral diplomacy, say what you want about the G8 global partnership, I do think that there should be some better connection between what the G8/G20 is doing and what the Nuclear Security Summit is doing, because there's a lot of overlap in those areas. So let me identify 7 key issues that I think the Nuclear Security Summit should seek to make progress on as we move forward. And this violates the 5-10 rule. I decided to split the difference and go with 7 and a half. 7 and a half. I have 3 auxiliary ones. It brings me up to 10. So the first is, I think that one of the most important objectives for the Seoul Summit needs to be to build confidence that what happened in 2010 wasn't a mirage or a cloud, but is really being implemented. So I do think that tracking commitment implementation on what was done in Washington is very, very important. And I put that first on the list because I think that without that, people will say, well, is this process real? Is it really making a difference? So I think that there needs to be a transparent report on the commitments that were made, both the quote-unquote house gifts as well as what was in the work plan. And I also think that we have to allow that should be an exchange of information behind closed doors among governments, so that there's confidence within the bureaucratic mechanisms as well. But I think the idea ought to be, the fundamental underlying idea is we need to build confidence that things are being done that weren't being done before. Second, I think we need to strengthen the physical material security regime. And I don't want to go into all the details that were in the communique and the work plan, but I want to add a couple of things that I think we ought to do. One is, I think we should be thinking about endorsing stress tests for nuclear material security. Now, I was enthusiastic about this idea when the Europeans announced it, and then I became a lot less enthusiastic about it when I saw how they were actually implementing it. But I think that the issue here is there's a value in stress testing the system and doing it in a way that allows countries, either individually or across borders, to understand what where things need to be improved. Let me put it that way. So I do think that stress tests, at least in concept or something, the details need to be worked out because it's a sensitive issue depending on what facility you're talking about. But I do think as a concept, stress tests are something that should be endorsed and solved. Second, I applaud the president for putting the 4-year agenda on the radar of a lot of countries and on the top of his national security priority list. But by this time next year, the 4 years will almost be expired. So I think what we ought to do is recognize that the 4-year goal gave this issue a real boost, but change the focus to the fact that nuclear material security is a lifetime objective. It's not a 4-year goal. It's something that we have to strive to improve year over year over year. And then the third issue that I would like to see some progress on under this category of physical materials security regime strengthening is concrete steps on eliminating excess stockpiles of plutonium and highly enriched uranium, and then some steps by some countries to limit or end the production. And I think here we're really talking about South Asia. I don't hold high hopes for this, but I do think that it's the problem of securing these stockpiles becomes harder when you keep pouring water into the sink, and it keeps getting higher and higher. The third issue on my list is fund global nuclear security. I think this is absolutely critical because without blood, the heart does not work, and money is the heart and the blood of this system. So I think we need to better integrate what our objectives are with what's going on with the G8 and the G20. I think we need to recognize clearly that there are budget backlashes and all countries that are involved in this issue, and that it's going to affect future commitment implementation and opportunity exploitation if we don't provide enough money. So I think that instead of trying to continue to go to the G8 well, we need to find a way to tap the G20 well, because those are countries where their economies are growing as opposed to what's happening in the United States and in Europe at the moment. And I can talk a little bit more about that, but I think one of the things we ought to do that might entice countries to do more at home is to give them a credit for the cost of the improvements that they make at home against what they might, against what they would contribute to the G8 global partnership as a G20 country or as a G8 country. Basically, if you make improvements at home, you ought to get credit for it. It's not just giving money to make credits in another country. 4, enhance technical and educational engagement. I mean, clearly the whole issue of the knowledge base is very important. The best practices issue is very important. I would like to see in Seoul countries identify specific educational and training activities that they're going to host. I would like to see some kind of a statement about how the centers of excellence are going to be integrated and what they're going to produce in the short term or over the medium term. And I would like to find a way, as I said, to partner the major stakeholders, which in my view are the governments, the industry, and the expert/academic community that cares. 5th, standardize nuclear material security. This is a very tall order, but we don't have a baseline that everyone adheres to now in the security of their nuclear materials, which makes it virtually impossible to judge the effectiveness unless you have teams going in and looking at specific sites and facilities. This is how we did it in Russia. I mean, it was very time intensive and very expensive to send teams of laboratory people and DOE people to each facility to look at the security, to make individual recommendations, to negotiate how they were going to be done, to come back, write the contracts, on and on and on. So if there was a baseline of even a minimum baseline for nuclear and radiological material security, it would help, I think, judge how other countries have confidence in the improvements that are being made in countries where there are defects or problems. And also, I think that it would help individual countries understand what it is that they should be striving to achieve as an international standard. And I think you could create some kind of a technical working group that's a subsidiary of the Sherpa group to work on this issue. 6, totally agree with Chris. Secure radiological sources as a priority. You know, I don't think it should be a difficult issue to secure all high-intensity radiological sources in public buildings, including hospitals, in the major countries of this world. We're doing it in the United States, piece by piece. There's not enough money to do it everywhere, but this is an issue where I think the United States should lead, and I think it's an issue that is completely non-controversial, and I think would really help to decrease the danger of radiological terrorism. You could also do things on a regional basis, a little bit harder, to do in some regions like the Middle East, maybe a little bit easier to do, say, in North Asia, Northeast Asia. And then my final and seventh issue is one where I think I'm going to clash violently with Laura, and that is I think we need to strengthen. But Laura wins because she definitely has the better power color today than I do. I think we need to strengthen the nuclear security safety interface. I will tell you, I feel like a reformed smoker, you know. I really thought at the beginning that we should leave safety off. But I have now come to the conclusion that after Fukushima, there's a couple of things that I think that are indisputable and that we have got to grasp onto. One is a nuclear crisis, no matter what the source, release of radiation, is not going to respect borders. And we have not going to be able to deal with it on a national basis. The Japanese weren't able to deal with it on a national basis, and the radiation drifted across the Pacific Ocean into the United States, into other countries. We've got to grapple with the fact that nuclear accidents and nuclear terrorism is not a purely national issue, and there have to be global approaches and regulations to this. Second, I think that there are certain aspects of the nuclear safety regime that have lessons that we can learn in nuclear security. For example, there are reporting requirements under the Convention on Nuclear Safety that are done at the IAEA. They're done confidentially. And I think those kinds of ideas could be implemented in the nuclear security area. And then thirdly, I think that nuclear safety is an issue where operators and governments and technical people feel more secure with what the regime is than nuclear security, which deals with very sensitive materials. And I think it may be that if we use safety as a pathway into this issue, we'll be able to push on a door that swings a little bit more freely than trying to run the other way, which is tell people you need to just secure your nuclear materials. So I think that there's some interface there. I think that interface needs to be identified and developed because I don't think it's been well developed. But I do think that it will help countries that are resistant on nuclear material security to engage on this issue a little bit more aggressively, and also I think it can help with the evolution of the regime. So, as we move forward, I think there are just three key issues that we need to keep in mind. One is we need to keep high-level political attention on the issue, whether it's through the summit process, whether it's through another process. I really congratulate Laura and her colleagues and her boss, the President of the United States, for bringing this to a high level of political attention. I think it's a hard thing to do, and I think if you lose it, you won't recreate it. So I'm all for keeping the political people involved in the process. The second thing I think we need to really be thinking about from a macro standpoint is how we're going to streamline and improve the current system. It is currently balky, it's bureaucratically taxing, and it's unnaturally and artificially balkanized. And I think there are several things that we need to do that I outlined to build this 21st century regime that I think would be much more flexible in meeting the challenges. And then the third thing from a macro standpoint is we need to shore up the funding. And there I think that the G8, G20 and the Nuclear Security Summit objectives, there's a natural confluence between those two. And in fact, the G8 meeting is in Chicago in May this year. And so it's an opportunity, I think, to put some meat on the bones in the United States of what the global partnership is going to do. So I think at the Nuclear Security Summit has the opportunity to drive this process, but if the Nuclear Security Summit process is not going to continue, then we need to find a way to continue the work of the Nuclear Security Summit in some alternative forum, whether that's some coalition of the willing or leaders of countries that have lots of nuclear assets. I'm not sure exactly how it is that we're going to do it, but I think if you give up the summit process, you're going to have to find another way to continue to make progress on this, and I think that, therefore, I'm not eager to give up on the summit process. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you to all of our panelists for allowing us ample time for questions from our audience. So at this point, we have...
Jen, can I just interrupt briefly?
Yes,
There's
absolutely.
a lot of responses I could give to what these two gentlemen just offered, but I've got to... I won't do that now. I've really got to correct some facts on the Belarus.
Okay.
The
All I know is what I've read in the papers. So.
Well, you didn't read very much in the papers because, by contrast to what you said, we haven't been trumpeting this. There was one press release at the time of the meeting between Secretary Clinton and her Belarusian counterpart, and very little further conversation about it for very good reasons. A, because we knew it was a fragile deal, and B, because there's no point in trumpeting that success with that government and that challenge until after it's done. So I really take issue with the notion that we highlighted it, and that we programmed it as a success at the summit. I've never written a summit fact sheet that includes the Belarus deal in it. Secondly, there was zero financial assistance involved. It's the typical GTRI approach. We'll pay to remove the material. That doesn't mean we pay the Belarusians. It means we pay our contractors or Russian contractors. We will provide them, just like we have in a number of other countries, with equivalent amounts of LEU to the HEU that they send out in the moment of the exchange. So they don't get that material unless the good stuff comes out. And so they have not received anything in exchange for material that they haven't removed. Now, they did remove some material in December, very quietly. We didn't fanfare it, we didn't trumpet it. They got some small amount of LEU compensation for that. But there is no financial assistance, no fungibility, unless Lukashenko was going to build refuel his accelerator anyway. So I really have to object to the concept that deal is in any way different from any of the other GTRI approaches, and that it has any more of an effect of commoditizing nuclear material.
Oh, well, that's good news, certainly. It sounds like your problem is less with me than with the coverage in the New York Times, which I had no alternative but to rely upon. So that's good news. I'm a strong supporter of GTRI, and I wish it continued success.
Thank you. And there are a couple of microphones, so if you could please wait until you have the microphone in your hand to introduce yourself and tell us any affiliation you might have, and then provide us with a concise question. I see right in the center, and the microphone is headed your way.
I'm Alan Krass. I used to work in the State Department on exactly these problems. And I just can't resist a comment, if I may, on the exchange between Laura and Chris. Chris, I think you were right on with your highlighting of this moral hazard problem. And I think Laura is exactly right in saying how the government tries to handle this. But I have to go back at least 10 years, it's more than 10 years now, to the very first successful operation of getting HEU out of a former Soviet ally in Serbia. And we learned at that time that as you approached the actual culmination of this deal, first of all, we couldn't deal with Milosevic all those years. We wanted to get that stuff out of there. Milosevic then was what Lukashenko is now. You can't deal with him. There's no way. But finally that changed. We got a friendly government. But at the last minute, as we were about to make the deal, the price went up dramatically. And Laura remembers that, I'm sure. It's an inherent problem that we have dealt with from the very beginning in this. And Chris, you actually, I think you see that. The more anxious we are to get this material out of some place, the higher the price is going to go. Because unfortunately, many, many countries do not share the concerns that we have about this, and they see it as a bargaining chip. And I think the program, GTRI, as it's called now, it wasn't called that then, is faced with this in every single way, whether it's converting a research reactor to LEU, whether it's getting HEU out of a country and back to Russia or back here, the price keeps going up. I think the same thing happened in the cooperative threat reduction program. The price with the Russians kept going up, and I remember many, many discussions about that. I think it's inherent in the problem, and it's something we're going to have to continue to deal with. Now, I have no quarrel with the way Laura and the administration have dealt with Belarus. I understand how difficult that problem is, and we're probably just going to have to wait until whoever replaces Lukashenko comes before we're going to get that settled. And we certainly shouldn't pay blackmail for it. But I think to consider something like that as a failure of the GTRI program is also a terrible mistake, because in every one of these situations we are dependent on the cooperation of the government that is trying to get this. I remember, speaking of the New York Times, I remember one of our operations, I don't remember which one it was, they said the United States swooped in and seized HEU from a research reactor. So I used to start referring to all of these operations as swoop and seize operations. They are not like that. They're not like that at all. So we have very limited power to make this kind of thing happen, and it takes a lot of diplomacy and a lot of patience. So
Any reaction?
I think both Chris and Laura are right in raising this point.
Any reactions from the panel before we move to another question?
I just want to add one more, well, make sure that we aren't left with the misimpression that the U.S. pays anybody cash for any of this stuff. Nunn-Lugar, GTRI, it's U.S. funds, activities that manages threats in these countries. This is not, the price going up is a different question, but it's not a price, it's not a financial price. But the point I want to make about Belarus as well is that the concerns are not just theft from the facility. And I think about to one of the huge successes of the Bush administration of the removal of HU from Libya, and how differently we would be thinking about the upheaval in that country over the last little bit if he still had his HEU. You certainly can't look at Belarus and say that however the government may change, that it would be peaceful and democratic and predictable, and that we would all lie snug in our beds at night not worrying about the HEU. That, as long as that HEU is there in that kind of instability with that kind of a leader, it's a threat, no matter how safely it's secured at the site.
It's hard to argue with that. As I indicated in my remarks, I think that the principle of HE removal is important, and I've been a supporter of that aspect of U.S. programming for a long time. GTRI is not the first time it began. That was, I think, of March 2004 when that got going. Already we had been trying to do that for quite a few years, although that was a point at which efforts accelerated considerably. But this has been a long-standing bipartisan priority across multiple administrations, and it's I agree completely. And I was actually involved in the Libyan effort when I was at the State Department, and I'm very glad that we got out what we got out. It would be a very different and more alarming world if all that material, and not just the material, but in some respect even more problematically the tools and the technology were still running around out there someplace. So thank God for that.
Another question here in the center. And then after that, there's another up here in the front of the room by the column.
Well, thank you to the panelists for a really interesting discussion so far. My name is Daniel Lakin from the Korea Economic Institute. As the hosts of the upcoming summit in 2012, I guess this question is mostly for Laura Holgate. Do you know the South Koreans, are they expecting anything specific out of the summit? Do they have any specific set of goals for, or are they simply playing the role of moderator or not moderator but participant? Do they have any specific goals out of the summit? Thank you.
The Koreans are very firmly in charge of the summit. They're the initial drafters on all the documents. They lead the meetings. They often ask me or my boss, Gary Seymour, in our roles as sous Sherpa and Sherpa, to co-chair those meetings. But this is a Korean agenda. I think I haven't talked with them about how they define their own internal goals. They share the general goals that we identified in terms of looking forward to the summit in 2012 as an opportunity to track progress against existing commitments, to make new commitments. And I think they also want to obviously highlight their role on the global stage as a major player in this issue. One of the interesting things about Korea that is both similar and different to the U.S. is that they will have 2 additional summits besides the official summit. In the U.S. In 2010, The NGO community put together a large summit-type gathering the day before the official summit, and then the Nuclear Industry Institute hosted an event focusing on industry components of nuclear security the day after the summit. But the way U.S. government works, those were knowledgeable to us, but we were not directing them from the government point of view. It's a little bit different in Korea. They can do a little more direction. And so they will have both an expert summit and an industry summit. I think they're both scheduled prior to the official summit. And certainly I expect that the industry summit will be, a moment to highlight Korea's nuclear technology capabilities, their role in international nuclear commerce, and even some of the nuclear security techniques that they've developed at some of their research centers, nuclear research centers. So they are interested in showing the world that they're arrived. This is part of their global Korea concept that included hosting the G20, hosting the Olympics, several other globally visible activities. So this is definitely part of their global outreach.
Here, next to the column, in blue suit.
Thank you very much for the panelists for your very interesting and useful remarks. I have one question for Laura and one question for Chris. For Laura, the question is that I heard that my Chinese colleague, I forgot to say
yes.
who I am. My name is Li Bin. I'm from Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and Tsinghua University in Beijing. My Chinese colleagues told me that they very much want to have cooperation with their American colleagues, especially in preventing nuclear terrorist attack in big events like Olympic Games. Their American counterparts very much like to work with the Chinese, my Chinese colleagues, and like to provide assistance. But the United States also has export control against China. That is pose some difficulties for two sides to develop cooperation. So my question is that would the United States and China have some kind of dialogues bilaterally or multilaterally at the Nuclear Security Summit in Seoul to solve that problem? So I want your comment. For Chris, I have another question. That is, some American security experts went to China to talk with Chinese experts about North Korea. They encourage China to have North Korea improve the North Korean nuclear security and safety. The Chinese government, I believe, is very reluctant to do that because you mentioned North Korea in your talk. Also, I want what is your recommendation? What China should do on this regard? Thank you.
Thank you. To go first.
Well, it's actually it's a fascinating question to talk about nuclear security in North Korea, because it's certainly from the U.S. perspective, we're in an interesting dilemma. I mean, part of the Pyongyang's diplomatic game, of course, is to do everything possible to provide opportunities to portray itself as an ordinary, legitimate player amongst all of the other nuclear weapons possessors of the world, and we have, I think, diplomatically, we have to be very cautious not to encourage or lend credence to any such pretension. On the other hand, of course, it is not hard to imagine that nuclear security is an area in which the North Korean government is woefully lacking. I mean, I don't know this for a fact, but it's easy to imagine. So in a sense, the challenge is to find a way to hopefully see that improve somewhat, while yet not providing it with the diplomatic goodies and credibility and legitimacy that it desires. And it may be, in fact, be the case that Beijing has the key to that, in the sense that these are two governments that have ongoing contacts and discussions on a whole range of issues of a sort that it would be very problematic, I think, for Western participants in the six-party process to have at this point without some tangible signs of seriousness on North Korea's part. So it may in fact be that Beijing has something of a key to helping improve this kind of thing. And I guess I should point out historically that, that there is some precedent for working on nuclear security type issues, even across great ideological and security divides. I mean, the U.S. officials played at least some small role in encouraging the Soviet Union to adopt improved, particularly nuclear weapons security, but not only that, well before the end of the Cold War. So, it may be that Beijing actually does have an important role to play, and I'd love to see them take a more active role in helping, frankly, in all aspects of the North Korean nuclear challenge, a more active role in helping bring Pyongyang back into a position of seriousness on the negotiations and on these issues more generally. So one can hope.
To your point of U.S.-Chinese cooperation on nuclear security and countering nuclear terrorism, that's something we absolutely welcome and is well underway. One of the commitments from China at the last summit was to create this a Chinese Center of Excellence, looking at regional partners, but also at the importance of improving security capabilities within China and the various communities that have that responsibility. And one of the highlights of President Obama's recent visit to China was the signature of an MOU establishing U.S.-Chinese cooperation in the context of that Center of Excellence. And since then, there have been over 8 meetings of our various teams working together to help identify both how U.S. and China can work together in that center to improve and expand the capabilities and knowledge in the region, but also how U.S. And China can work together to improve nuclear security capabilities within China. I'm not aware that there's any export control boundaries imposed there. I'll ask the question, but my information is that that cooperation is going well, nice and low key. Don't need a lot of fanfare around it, but rich and content filled. So I'm eager to have that built upon and to have China take a lot of credit for that in the next summit.
Let me just make a comment. Lee, Ben, on your question, just picking up on a little bit on what Laura and what Chris had to say, I don't know why the Chinese government would be reluctant to bring a set of technical people from DPRK to their new technical center of excellence and show them some of the techniques which are used to secure nuclear materials. I mean, I don't want to confer nuclear weapons legitimacy on the country, though they have already detonated 2 nuclear explosions, so it's kind of a little difficult not to, but they have material, they have the capacity to produce more material, they have the capacity to potentially produce HEU, and I wouldn't want, as that stockpile potentially grows, to not know what the security measures are that are in place. And secondly, I think that the converse of the nuclear weapons legitimacy argument is that you would give the North Koreans the opportunity, should they want to take it, to show that they are more of a global citizen than they have been, at least in this very narrow and important area. So I think that the upside outweighs the downside.
Any other questions from our audience? Up to the right here.
Hi, Rebecca Lorden from AAAS. Ms. Holgate, you said that you wanted to see consensus move forward in locations where we might be stuck. Can you identify maybe a few places that you would like to see consensus be built?
Sure. I think one of the realities of negotiations when you've got 50 different people and institutions in the room is that you end up with a lot of weasel words. So one of the key things about the consensus that we got in April of 2010 is the entirely voluntary character of all the commitments made in the communiqué and the work plan. Obviously, the national commitments are things that countries actually intended to do. But the diverse character of the participants in the summit process mean that the actual steps involved in the work plan are applicable only to some countries and are applicably differently to various countries. And so there's a lot of areas where it was actually necessary for countries to say, yes, I'll agree to that on a voluntary basis because it may not even apply to me. I might not even have material in my responsibility. But what I'd love to see as we move forward to the summit, and I'm not going to be able to commit that this will be the outcome, but to see a few of those weasel words kind of softened or removed as we move towards some of those similar concepts. One of the issue has to do with HEU minimization. And whenever any language like that gets put in any kind of international document, there's a whole range of, when technically and economically feasible, depending upon the availability of medical isotopes and so on. And so I'd love to see some countries just come out and say, we're going to do it by X date. We're going to actually take this step, and we will have decided that it is technically and economically feasible to do X or Y by a particular date. I'd like to see the key treaties that are referenced in the summit. Even there, the expression of a wish for universalization of those treaties is couched in some limiting terms. I'd really love to see some of those terms removed, and in fact be able to say, as a consensus, all 47 of us believe that these treaties should be universal in character, and we've either ratified them or we're on a path to doing so. So those are a couple areas where I think we could actually, moving the consensus would have some real effect. Since I've mentioned treaties, I would be remiss to say that the U.S. Needs to do that too. And the administration has twice introduced legislation to Congress that would update our laws on those treaties that would allow us to deposit our instruments of ratification. The two relevant treaties have already received advice and consent from the Senate in 2008. So this is not an advice and consent issue. This is a rationalizing our civil code so that we can effectively prosecute and sentence nuclear terrorists. This is, motherhood, apple pie, and good housekeeping, at least. But we've been unable to get that bill passed in the last 2 years. So I'm really hopeful that we can get that through Congress this year, get it to the President's desk, and be able to deposit our instruments of ratification before the summit next March.
I saw another hand here in the black directly behind.
Hi, my name's Ashley. I just finished my graduate studies at King's College London and moved here fresh off the plane. So I'm going to shake things up for Ken. Kenny, any preference?
Ken is fine.
Ken?
Kenny, I think there's only one person in all of the world that calls me Kenny.
I don't want to be number two then. I don't want to go
No,
there.
don't be number two.
I've written a lot of papers on a lot of the things you were talking about, just kind of creating some good points on how to address, nuclear radiological security. And what I thought was interesting was your number 5, you saying that we should have some teams going in or sites and have some sort of baseline. And that's actually an argument that I made. And I found myself with the department chair of the Department of War Studies looking at me saying, well, how do you propose we do that without offending everybody? So, Ken,
Yeah.
I'm going to bring this one to you because I looked at him with a blank stare and went home and did a little more research. And I think that a big challenge in the political climate that we're in is how to get things done without being offensive, how to be diplomatic. I think it's an amazing idea to have a baseline. I think that's important, but how?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's you got to start with what you're already standing on, which is, as Laura mentioned, what the IAEA recommendations are. IMCIRC 225 revision number 5, I think, is what it is. So there's a lot in that document that, if it was fully implemented, I think would go a long way toward doing this. The problem is we don't know how individual countries implement those recommendations, and that's all they are, is recommendations. Let's just take a couple of examples. Let's leave Russia aside, because we actually know quite a bit about how Russia does it, and we know quite a bit about how we do it, and we're the two biggest holders of this material. We don't have a lot of good information, for example, about how the Indians do it. We probably know to some degree how the Pakistanis do it. China probably have some information, maybe not all information. So I think the problem is, instead of hunting and pecking, which is what we're doing now to try and ferret out pieces of information, it would be useful if there was a uniform baseline. I don't think you can get there through some kind of consensus process. I think consensus, to me, is the C in lowest common denominator. It just you're never going to get what you want by having 47 countries sitting around the table trying to figure out, with all due respect to Laura, who's had an extremely difficult job managing this process for the United States, and Gary as well. I just don't think you're going to get there. I do think what we need in the House gift component of this is exactly what Laura just said. Some number of countries, let's say the G8, come up and say, we think that this is an important issue as a group, and we're going to explore it, move toward this direction, try to figure out how we might make this work, and then have some group of leaders put an idea down on the table that other countries can react to, and then you build off of that leadership moment. That's what I think needs to happen. I think if you go to Pakistan and give them a veto, you're going to get exactly what's happening in the Conference on Disarmament, which is a lot of diplomatic lunches with no results in the Conference on Disarmament on a fissile material cutoff. So I think we need to find a way to lead. And I don't think that that leadership needs to be everybody holding hands together. I think it needs to be leaders deciding we have a problem and we need to try to solve it, and this is how we're going to go about it. That would be my suggestion.
Jennifer, can I jump in on that? The IAEA actually has a mechanism to do this called IPAS. Are you familiar with IPAS missions? It's the International Physical Protection Advisory Service, and it is totally voluntary, as it must be with all things in Vienna. But it is a mechanism by which countries can ask the IAEA to come evaluate their sites against the current revision of the IAEA's guidelines for physical protection. And in fact, in exactly the model that Ken described, the U.S., for the very first time as one of our House gifts at the last summit, invited an IPAS mission to an HEU facility in the United States. The purpose of that being precisely to this point of demystifying what's the word I'm looking for? Making it a more positive thing to do an IPAS mission. Unfortunately, up until now, IPAS missions have typically been the beginning point of less capable countries to asking for help and asking for assistance. And so they come in, they give a baseline, there's a delta, and you want to fill it out. What I really want to see happen is moving these IPAS missions from things that begin an assistance conversation to the things that responsible countries do. Every now and then it's good to have somebody come in, take a look at what you're doing as against a global standard, or standard's the wrong word, a global guideline, and say, here's where you could improve. And even the U.S. can benefit from that. And that's the point that I wanted to make in having us make that offer. The UK made the same offer. The Finns made a similar offer. A couple of other major nuclear countries have requested IPAS missions since then. Now the challenge is, back to the fundraising, is how do we make sure that the IAEA has the money to actually go and implement these things? And to the degree there are gaps found in countries that qualify assistance, how do we make sure that those gaps get filled? But I think this is something that only accumulates over time. It's not something that one can go in and establish as a global practice. But there's another tool out there, and I want to look, taking from Ken's point about models from the safety world that we can replicate in the security world. One of those models is the World Association of Nuclear Operators. This was established after 3 Mile Island in Chernobyl by the nuclear industry, people who run nuclear power plants themselves, who said, oh my gosh, if there's a safety problem, again, anywhere in the world, we're all going to suffer. And we're seeing exactly that today. And so what they did over time, accumulating trust, is peer review, safety peer reviews by each other, confidential reports of the findings, industry-level benchmarkings in terms of outages due to safety issues, in terms of human, worker injuries or worker health issues associated with safety procedures at these reactors. And now, after 30 years, that's an established practice. 3 years ago, a similar institution was created on that model for nuclear security. It's called the World Institute for Nuclear Security. It's based in Vienna. And while you don't start out with peer reviews, certainly the notion of using it as a platform for sharing best practices, for exactly what Ken said in terms of bringing international experts, industry experts, government experts together to talk about best practices and improve behavior in the security realm. Over time, they may be able to come to a point of being able to do these peer reviews through a WINS type institution or through WINS itself. So I think we have to look at how do we accumulate behavior, how do we show it's painless, how do we show it's part of being a grown-up in the nuclear world, and then, you know, show the non-participants by their absence.
If I could just sort of tag on to that, I think that makes a lot of sense. And with respect to IPAS in particular, I think that the sort of the political or psychological shift that Laura mentioned between IPAS being a mechanism by which, you know, countries, I mean, it's sort of an acquisitive mechanism. Here, come, you know, let's do a visit so you can come and see how awful my security is so that I can justify asking you for more money. Shifting from that to this being a routine part of what it is that, you know, grown-up in the nuclear security world do. If you can make that kind of cultural jump, you will have accomplished a great deal, I hope.
Yes.
I just had a question. My name is Scott Gusenberg. I'm a Hudson intern. And I was curious, given the inherent complexity of gaining more than a non-binding consensus in the form of a communique, is there a possibility of track 2 or even track 3 dialogue in order to help facilitate more binding agreements through nations that could eventually be subsumed under a nuclear security summit platform? It's something that, but other than that, basically other mechanisms by which you can add more teeth to these agreements. Because it seems that nuclear security summit, as great as it is to have these track 1 dialogues to all these heads of state, it seems that that in and of itself might make it harder to come to make substantive agreements that could potentially be beneficial along the line.
Anybody?
I think Ken obliquely suggested a way to do that, and that is with the angle of sort of a stronger emphasis on accountability and tracking and that sort of thing. It's not teeth in the formal sense, but it allows a bit more name and shame pressures than is otherwise the case when all that one has as a diplomatic mechanism is, you know, me coming and saying, you know, here is my description and characterization of what I did over the last 2 years. Isn't that great? And everyone else sort of says, oh, well, I guess so. It sounds nice. Thank you very much. You know, with a bit more data available for that process of accountability, you might see some informal teeth.
I mean, I would just say, first of all, there is a track 2 or 3. I'm not sure what the difference between 2 and 3 is, but I know there is this, as Jennifer mentioned, this Fissile Material Working Group, which is a lot of people in the United States and then some foreign, 25 or 30 foreign people. And the idea is to try and put pressure through that informal track on governments to take actions. But I think one to kind of underscore your real objective here, which is to, and I think what we're all trying to get at, which is to have a little bit more concreteness in this process and similarity across the way countries do things. I do think it's important that we don't all just swim in our own pool. In other words, the NGO people are swimming in their pool, and the government people in theirs, and the industry people in theirs. And I think part of what's starting to happen, I mean, we have a dialogue with the government people, that's no question about that. But we don't have a very good dialogue with the industry people. And so we have been trying to break that wall down, and it's built because they think that most of the academics / experts in the NGO world are anti-nuclear, but in fact not all of them are anti-nuclear, and some of them actually recognize that nuclear power is here to stay, and we're going to have to deal with it, and we need to figure out how to deal with it safely and securely. So I do think that the idea I like for this is to have an intercessional between the summits, this not to be organized by any government people, that brings together the industry people, not putting any more challenges on your plate, Laura. It could be organized. I don't know who would organize it. Maybe the industry would organize it, but brings together the key stakeholders to talk at the midway point about where we are in this process and where it is that we need to go, so that it's not all just on the backs of the Sherpas and people in the government that have to do this. And I think if you brought government people, the expert community, and the industry and / operators into the dialogue, I think that that could be a very interesting discussion, and then you would have all of the players kind of working off of the same sheet, or at least off of the same sheet of potential objectives. Yeah, I think governments take the industry seriously, and I think governments take academics sometimes seriously and sometimes with a grain of salt. I would say that the ratio is probably 99-1. I'm not saying in which direction.
I always take you seriously, Ken.
Well, Laura, that's a special exception. But I do think that governments do take what the industry have to say, and legislators, frankly, I think, take what the industry have to say very seriously because they're the ones that are operating the plants and doing the security and things like that if they're commercial. And so I think getting the industry into this dialogue in a more substantial way is a really, really important objective. And last year we had these 3 pools in Washington, and I could just tell you, well, I got in touch with some former State Department person that Laura and I know, and said, I don't know anybody at the Nuclear Energy Institute that would actually talk to me. Can you give me an introduction? And he did, and I got in touch with Marv Fertel, who's the head of NEI, and I said, we're doing this thing, and you guys are doing that thing, and we should probably talk to each other. And, we had Marv then went back and said, who is this guy? And decided that, okay, I was worthy of a response. And what happened is we had essentially an exchange of prisoners. So one of their guys came to our meeting, and then 2 of our guys went to their meeting. And that was the beginning of a, kind of spit and start dialogue where in Seoul now, we really are talking more about how do we make the academic event complementary to what the industry event is, the industry event complementary to the government event and the NGO event. And so I think we're kind of on this track, but it really was, I think it's important, and I think that we finally have started to move in that direction.
I couldn't agree more with Ken about this industry thing. I'm really glad to hear you say that the communities are becoming more connected. We still have this structural problem of 3 separate summits, and I think it's really hard for anybody to think about, well, how do you bring the content of the industry summit and the content of the expert summit into the official summit? Do you bring people? Is there a report? Or the mechanisms of it make it difficult, but the relationships and the progress and the commitment and the focus of it can't be beat. And I think it's really important that we remember that industry, it's not really the power plants that are the biggest concern from a nuclear security point of view in the context of the summit. Here we're talking about HEU and plutonium. Most power plants don't have it. So it's really the fuel cycle facilities, it's research reactors. These are kind of different components of the nuclear industry than we have represented strongly here in the U.S. because we don't have a closed fuel cycle. So a lot of the companies that have the greatest responsibility for this material are not U.S. firms. And so here's where we really, having the Koreans take a leadership role in an industry connection is really helpful, even though they also don't have those firms, but it's a different voice. So I think that's a critical component of the conversation. We need to think about not so much industry divided up nationally, but industry divided up in sectors. What can the fuel cycle community bring? Over half of the nuclear material, weapons usable nuclear materials on this planet are in private hands. We need to remember that. And they have a role. They need to remember that they need to be coming to the table with their own commitment, with their own corporate responsibility, with their own recognition of that at the highest internal managerial level, and a reflection of that throughout their entire organization, that is their responsibility. It's not the regulator's responsibility. It's not the government's responsibility.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience? Here in the front, and there's also one toward the back over here.
Hi, my name is Peter Husey, and this question is for all 3. What role would nuclear forensics or tagging nuclear material play, or could it play, in the ability to keep track of not only stuff that has been secured, but stuff that gets out of the secured facility, either deliberately or by, for example, someone selling it or someone stealing it?
Well, nuclear material is tagged. I mean, you don't need to tag it. It has its own natural isotopic distinctions.
I was gonna say what you really need is the baseline.
Exactly. You need the library against which to compare it. And if you look at the Nuclear Security Summit work plan, it calls for the development of national libraries. The U.S. has the beginnings of one, but it's really hard because you need samples from, every enrichment batch, every reprocessing run, every fuel type. And for a large nuclear a country with a lot of nuclear experience like the U.S. or Russia or France or the U.K. or whatever, the process of just building that library is daunting, and we're not finished. But certainly, forensics plays a huge role in the context of dealing with smuggling cases. If you, in the hopes that you catch something before it goes off, it plays a different and more sensitive role in the context of attributing uh, uh, the origin of material after an explosion, after a detonation. That's information that's only held by nuclear weapon states and should be that way. But one of the fascinating things that we're learning is that it's less, that at least equal and in some cases more of a contribution to addressing nuclear smuggling issues is not the nuclear forensics, it's the traditional forensics associated with that nuclear material. It's the pocket litter of the guy that happens to have a vial of plutonium in the other pocket. It's the investigatory trail. It's who's on his cell phone. It's that lash-up between law enforcement, intelligence, and technical forensics that is actually yielding our results when we have a successful case of nuclear smuggling. And there again, that's something that's highlighted in the summit work, is that interface between law enforcement and forensics and the intelligence component as well. And that's where Interpol, being a new arrival in our nuclear summit community, is a really valuable point.
Yeah, I would say nuclear forensics to me is like the, super fast train between Washington and New York. I desperately long for it, and the technology sounds great, but I'm not sure we're ever going to achieve it. And my life would be a lot easier if we did. I just think the technology of forensics is hard. I think the politics of the library is harder from a global perspective, but I don't think that either one of those barriers should limit our willingness to continue down this path, because it does hold enormous promise down the road, but I do think it's a very long-term prospect.
I should also point out that as a sort of an intelligence or attribution challenge, all data is good data. One doesn't have to have a complete baseline. It is useful to have negative information. You may have an incomplete library, which means you don't necessarily know what on earth this thing was that you just found, but you know that it wasn't this, and this. Every little increment of building islands of data that you can in that respect is I'm confident, much appreciated.
Thank you. And over here, go ahead.
Hi, James Tetlow, George Washington University. And I thought Ken made some very interesting points on how nuclear safety could contribute to the discussions on nuclear security. And since Laura takes them very seriously, I'm interested in knowing her responses to the 3 points he brought up, and if the summit's not an appropriate forum, what's an alternative forum where the two could be discussed? Thank you.
Ken's characterization of my reaction was uncharacteristically off base. I think he's exactly right on this. The question is, where do you do it best? I mean, there is even before Fukushima, the kind of novel new way to talk about nuclear security for the couple years before now was the safety security interface of the realization that safety measures or measures at a facility adopted to address safety might interfere with things you might do to secure, or vice versa. The importance of, from a regulatory point of view, making sure that these issues were considered jointly. And we've seen innovation within the International Atomic Energy Agency in terms of their two strands of work on safety and security becoming more and more connected, not only at the top, but also along the way in terms of procedures. And I think that's exactly right. There was a really great piece by Roger Housley, the head of WINS, right after Fukushima, identifying the security implications already visible from that situation. If a power goes off to a facility, the pumps don't work, the lights don't work, but so the electric fence isn't working, the badge reader isn't working, the cameras in the facility aren't working, the closed circuit TV is not working. A safety incident is a security incident, and vice versa. The other little factoid I learned about Fukushima is that the default position for the power going off is all the doors open. At a nuclear power plant, that's less of a problem because there's nothing in there that, from a nuclear materials point of view, that you could actually steal. If that happened at Rokasho or at La Hague or at a research reactor just around the corner up here in Gaithersburg, where we actually have material on site that's dangerous, that is a real problem with the safety security interface, and that's why we have to look at it really carefully. What is fascinating to me is that in the summit context, there's a stronger resistance than I certainly would have felt that to referencing this interface. And I don't know how to explain it because it involves people among the summit negotiators who I would think should know better. But the result is that there's likely to be very little of that connectivity within the summit. That doesn't mean that it's not important to do in all the other venues and mechanisms that we have out there. And I think WINS is looking at that safety security interface very effectively. I think the IAEA is spending a lot more time on that. I think national regulatory bodies are spending a lot of time on that. I know the NRC has always looked at that issue very closely. So I think there's a lot more we can do. I think as we gain insights from the Fukushima analysis, we'll see more and more instances of the connectivity. We need to be rolling those into both the safety and the security ways of thinking and acting as we go forward.
Up front.
Carl Robichaud, Carnegie Corporation of New York. Ken alluded to the radiological issue and suggested there were a few things that could be done at this summit that would be uncontroversial or relatively uncontroversial. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. What role do you think the radiological question will play at the summit? How can it be addressed? And is there a way to take some actual practical steps to put in place some momentum on that issue?
The radiological issue is absolutely going to be on the agenda in Seoul. There had been a number of countries who had argued for that, and initially a number of countries, including the U.S., that argued against it initially. There is a small reference to radiological issues in both the communique and the work plan for the first summit, but it is on purpose small. And I will say from the U.S. point of view, that was in part to avoid an easy distraction from countries who prefer to talk about radiological challenges, but who also have massive problems and concerns in the context of materials. And so it was important that we focus, that's where the president's focus was HEU and plutonium. That's what we needed to be sure we nailed the commitments we were able to get in 2010 on that issue. That having been done, adding radiological to the agenda in 2012 poses no problem for the U.S., or we'll have to see if any of the others who opposed it come up against that. I'm not in a position to talk about the current status of the negotiations of the communique. I'll just indicate I'm a little surprised at the timidity of those who argued so powerfully to include it in what they've actually proposed to include. So I think there is room to perhaps do more, but we're already pretty far into the negotiations, and I'd be surprised if there was a lot of new stuff added at this point.
Can I just make one comment on the GW questioners? The thing that bothers me about the safety security interface is that we had basically two opportunities after Fukushima institutionally to link the two, and we failed on both of them. The IAEA heads of state meeting, or whatever it was, high-level meeting on nuclear safety, just focused on nuclear safety, even though people argued to do some small, even little piece of it on nuclear security. So that worried me. And then the second piece that worried me is the fight that occurred in Europe over whether or not you should stress test the reactors against terrorism. I mean, it does, even I, as a non-technical person, know that if you drive something into those spent fuel pools, you're going to have exactly the same problem that you had in Fukushima. So you can't say the reactors are safe when the spent fuel pools are filled with spent fuel, and they're not, potentially no water in them, or a gigantic hole if someone blows it up or drives a plane into it or something like that. So I think safety has, and the overlap between the two issues has to be recognized. And at least in post-Fukushima, those two examples are making me nervous, because there was a big fight in Europe about whether to include the terrorism issue, and the terrorism inclusion people lost decisively that fight, at least in this round. And so I think there's a lot of thinking, at the very least, on that subject that needs to go on. Sorry.
Okay. Last question. I saw a hand right in the center.
I'll make it quick. I know we're running short on time here. We talked a little bit, or the panel talked a little bit about problems with our current debt situation and the obvious funding issues that come with that. So you talked a little bit about including industry in the dialogue. Where did you include the private sector role at the 2010 summit in securing nuclear material, and where do you see that dialogue going with the next summit in 2012?
Well, as I mentioned, the There was a nuclear industry summit the day after the official summit, in which industry leaders got together and talked about how important nuclear security was. I think even the organizers of that summit would be hard put to say, and therefore X company did Y action, or, I'm not sure that, they certainly didn't come up with a communique or a work plan or house gifts or anything concrete in that commitment. But I think even just the awareness, if you're able to get a hold of the kind of summing up statement by Arliss Kanders from Westinghouse, really solid set of observations about the necessity of industry's engagement in the nuclear security agenda. There is a section in the work plan that highlights the role of the private sector, that talks about the relationship between the private sector and the government as a regulator, that talks about design of new facilities, which is largely in private sector hands, the importance of incorporating security provisions in the design phase, as well as all phases of the life cycle of the facility. Talks about the importance of the human role, and again, most of those humans are private sector employees. So that also redounds to the private sector's requirements. And then again, as you've heard, looking forward, the industry event will be doing, there will be an industry summit on the margins of the 2012 event, and I am not involved in that planning, but maybe someone in the room is. And I'm hopeful that can take the conversation a couple steps farther in terms of commitments from industry in terms of their own responsibilities and actions on security.
In response to his question? There's a microphone coming from right.
Thank you. I'm Melissa Mann with Urenco, which, as some of you know, is a multinational uranium enrichment company. And I can't even begin to speak for the industry because I think, as Laura has pointed out, the industry is very different things to different people. But I can assure you that at least my company and a number of others like us are very interested in what's happening next March. I would point out that while we're eager to participate, the industry event itself is also under the control of the Koreans, in the case of Korea Hydroelectric and KERI, the research institute. But we're hopeful that this time around we're also able to put a little more architecture in place. And so there are dialogues going on within the Nuclear Energy Institute, within our own companies. I know my company has already sent a letter to Laura and Gary talking about some of the things we'd like to see out of the summit. So to all of you, I don't think we need to wait every other year to have a dialogue. We look forward to talking now.
I'll agree with that last comment and thank our panelists tremendously for their time and sharing their thoughts and comments with us today. I will use a last moment to thank our collaborators on this, with Partnership for Secure America and Hudson Institute for hosting us today. I'll make a quick shameless plug for Stanley Foundation materials over there, including a piece by Ken about the nuclear security architecture. And give it back to Kathy for one last remark.
Yes, and actually I'm going to stand up for this one. We'll have some symmetry. I wish I had said this earlier because Alex Toma from the Connect US Fund was here, and they have actually funded these 6 panels that we've run over the last year, and without their support, we could not have done this. We also want to thank the panelists, the Stanley Foundation, because we really do want to start constructive dialogues like the one we saw today. And so thank you very much, and we certainly have to thank Chris Ford, who's done this for us several times now. And also we wanted to let you know we're taking this out to the states as well. We've already gone to Arizona with a panel. We're actually going to Tennessee. Jen's going next week. And then we're going to Georgia. So we do hope that this thought-based dialogue helps in the arena, and we thank you all for participating today. Thank you very much.
Yes, please. Well, you know my number.
Hey, Ina, how